Okay, so I'm about to do it. I'm going to do it. It is happening. Okay, so before I start this podcast, I want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for coming back. Don't forget to like, share, positive feedback, and comments. Don't forget to subscribe. If you would like to subscribe to my Spotify page, which you can listen to my podcast when I upload them, and you don't have to wait for premiere dates. You can go to the front of the YouTube channel, click the link. It's 99 cents a month. If not, you can just subscribe to my YouTube channel. Don't forget to hit the notification to notify you when I post new videos. And okay, so that is my spiel. Let's go. So I am compelled to do this video because I 100%, it was like on my mind in a very unhealthy manner, as with most things that have to do, and this is why I'm a nerd and I have come to accept it in my life, right? So for me, I've come to accept the fact that I become obsessed with things and I have to figure them out. And that's one reason why I'm a nerd. And so I have become obsessed with figuring out this whole time travel, the way that, okay, so this is the thing. The way that time travel has been explained in the DCEU as far as the Flash, because the Flash is the main character that travels back and forth in time, is very confusing. And after watching the movie, I did my review. If you haven't seen the review, check it out. It's in the description. I'll link it for the Flash movie. I talk about how confusing the idea of time travel and the timeline is, and needed some clarification. I was like, at the end of the day, I've been watching The Flash and the TV show The Flash for 9 years. It's been a long time, and I can't necessarily say that I've always kept it stored in the back of my head. But when I watch the explanation of time, because the Flash TV show does a really good job, where it's good as can be expected of explaining it, but I was like, I haven't kept that knowledge or information in my brain. So when I watched the movie, it just brought up all these questions again. So I had to do a deep dive into time travel, the multiverse, alternate worlds, and basically like a psycho have come to this conclusion. Okay, so here's my conclusion. I'm going to read it out. I wrote this whole thing because there's no way I'm going to talk about this coherently just off the top of my head. Okay. So the Flash in the movie, okay, we're starting with the Flash movie because that's where most of the questions stem from. So in the movie, the Flash goes back in time, and anytime the Flash goes back in time, it changes the future. So that's the premise of time travel, right? So when the Flash goes back in time, and anytime he goes back in time, it changes the future. Okay. Now, this is the thing. This is where it gets confused. That's very simple and easy. And that's what most people think time travel is. You go back in time, and then if you step on a bug, you change the future. So don't change anything. And then you go back to the future, right? That is very clear cut. And that is not how time travel works, right? So, okay. So let me see. Okay, so the multiverse, we're going to talk about the multiverse. So we're going to use a lot of multiverse, parallel, alternate timelines, things like that. So stick with me. The multiverse, which gets established in season 2 of The Flash, the CW TV show. Okay, the multiverse is actually all the existing alternate or parallel universes that are connected in some way. So when I say alternate or parallel, you have to understand they mean the same thing, because I go back and forth between alternate and parallel. They mean exactly the same thing. If you hear that rumbling in the back, it is my cat, because he has decided that he wants to tear my house up, as cats do. He has a lot of energy and he needs to get it out. Okay, now back to this podcast. So parallel universes are not alternate timelines, but alternate timelines are parallel universes. Okay, so if this makes sense, or let me explain how this makes sense. Okay, alternate timelines exist in the current universe, or whichever universe you exist in. So you can have alternate timelines in the same universe and have alternate universes that alternate timelines have not affected at all. Okay, guys, my cat is losing his mind. And then my dog is going to start barking in like 3 seconds. Apparently, my cat does not like to talk of alternate universes as it pertains to comic book and comic book things. He's trying to stop this podcast as best he can. Okay, so let's get back to it. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So parallel universes are not alternate timelines, but alternate timelines exist in the current universe or whichever universe you exist in. All right, so okay. So you can have created an alternate timeline that exists. Okay, wait, so what am I trying to say? Okay, so this is the question. If you create an alternate timeline, does the original timeline still exist and can you access it? So that's basically the premise of The Flash, the movie, right? If you watch the movie, you know this is why everything is so out of sync. And it's not until Bruce explains how alternate timelines work that Barry understands why things are different. But the plot hole, I think, or the point of confusion for me when I was watching it is, well, actually I'll talk about it because I go through what they don't cover in the TV show and why, and I'm sorry, in the movie, which they do cover in the TV show, and why time travel, multiple universes and, you know, different timelines is so confusing, convoluted, not just in the DC universe, but just in general. Okay, so the theory, or one theory that most comics seem to grab onto, is the multiple worlds theory. And that just seems to be across the board with just comics in general. So the multiple world theory was created in 1954 by Hugh Everett. And he theorized that the universe was splitting and that each split becomes its own universe. So whenever you make any decision about anything or anything happens to you, there is an alternate version of that decision or event in a parallel universe that plays out differently. And every decision and event that could possibly happen has happened in some other universe at the same time that it's happening across the multiverse. So I think the best way to explain this, and we'll talk about Loki in a little bit, but in the TV show Loki, actually it's the movie Inception, where they explain multiple universes and they get like into different dimensions, because how we view time is through a very fourth dimension or third dimension, I can't remember exactly, view. And so we view time as linear, which time is not linear, but because our dimension and how we access the dimensions, or what we can access when it comes to dimension, we only see time as linear, but in reality time is a circle. And so this explains that where all of the different timelines, the alternate universe and everything is all taking place at the same time, it's not linear, it's a circle, right? And we'll get into it more when I talk about Loki. So just remember that the biggest problem with, and when Barry encounters, when he, you know, goes into trying to access the past, is not understanding that time is not linear. Okay, so not trying to get too complicated with this, but this is the idea behind the multiverse, that's so popular in comics. So what is the difference between an alternate universe and alternate timelines? Well, not much, nothing really. So in most comics, including The Flash, there is much to do about parallel or alternate timelines. Okay, so in the Hughes version of parallel worlds, it is theorized that when you make a decision, that decision creates a parallel world where each decision or action or event has taken place. So it's like a branch tree. You make a decision, you're in this world, you're in this universe, you make a decision, it branches off, it creates a different world, universe, timeline. All of that coincides with decisions, events that happen to you in your world, in your universe, right? So if we use this version of parallel universes, that idea behind alternate timelines creates the parallel universe. So you can't have, in this theory, you cannot have alternate timelines without a parallel universe. So anytime Barry runs back in time and changes the events in the past, by that theory, he is creating a parallel universe. So he's in fact creating a different universe in which he is no longer existing in his previous universe. So it would suggest that Barry has jumped universes, not just timelines. So when Barry goes back to the past, he isn't going back to the past of his current timeline. He's going back to the past in an alternate universe, a different world in an alternate universe. Because the theory states that there is no timeline in each world. There is one timeline in each world. But when you experience life, basically it creates alternate timelines, but only in alternate universes. Okay, so in this world where I'm talking to you on this podcast, this is the timeline. I got up, I decided I was going to figure this out. I was going to drive myself crazy about it, figure out and do a podcast. At some point, with each decision that I made, it created a different world, a different universe, a different timeline where maybe I already knew how this stuff worked. I was never confused about it. Maybe I'm a theoretical scientist in a parallel universe. Maybe, I'm a writer on the Flash show and I'm the one that created the craziness around parallel universe. Maybe, I decided not to do the podcast, so I never figure it out. So that theory creates different timelines, and different timelines create different worlds and universes. So you cannot have, so in this world, this timeline, this universe where I'm talking and I'm making this podcast, this is the only option. I'm making the podcast. It's happening right now. I can choose to stop doing it in the middle of it and not post it. But right now, that is the decision I make. There is no alternate version of that decision. That decision was made. But there is an alternate version of that decision that exists in a different timeline, in a different universe. Okay? All right. So there we go. Hopefully that makes sense. So the implication is anytime time travel that occurs in comics actually happens, it's actually happening across universes. If any event changes, and only if events changes, but in theory, anytime you go back in time, that changes things in which the time travel paradox exists. Which is why every show or movie that has ever introduced time travel avoided this mess that the Flash and other comics have gotten themselves into, including Loki, which we'll talk about in a second. By reiterating how, so any show, you had, shows like, Star Trek, and basically any sci-fi show that's ever existed has dealt with time travel. But they always tell you that they've always managed to avoid the paradoxes because they say, do not, Back to the Future and everything. Don't do anything that could change any aspect of the past, even including stepping on a bug. And people's like, are you being ridiculous? Like, no, we're not being ridiculous. Don't change anything because we don't know how that will affect the future. Now, what they failed to mention, the understanding of the universe and just in general has evolved over the years. And we know that because it doesn't change that future, but it changes a different future. But anyway, to get back to the Flash. What was I talking about? Okay, so Loki. They reiterate how important it is to not change any aspects of the past because that would inevitably change the future, which from the explanation that I just gave about parallel universes means that you're creating an alternate world by creating that alternate timeline where you stepped on a bug. See, in the past has already happened, or the idea that time is, linear. In your universe, time is linear. The past has already happened. So if you travel back to the past and you step on a bug that you never stepped on in the past, that automatically changes the future because time is linear in your universe, your world. You can't change what has already happened. So it creates an alternate version of that timeline in a different world, in a different universe where it is allowed to change. Okay, so here are the implications that alternate timelines and alternate worlds are synonymous with each other, because based on this theory, you can't have an alternate timeline without it creating an alternate world for that new timeline to exist in, which is basically what I just said. So the question is, whenever Barry runs to the past and changes the timeline like he does in the Flash movie, which creates all those changes, which is explained but not really with the past Barry version of himself killing past Barry, when they are, when they're in a Speed Force. So the scene where present Barry wants to just allow his mother to die so that the timeline goes back to the original one to save Earth, which Earth he's trying to say, I have no idea. I don't think he knows. But past Barry doesn't agree. And then we find out that past Barry's future self, but not as future as the present Barry, actually past Barry, which is the Barry that kills past Barry. Okay. You know what? It's awesome. Okay. See, this is why this is confusing. Okay. Let me see. Let's backtrack. So you have present Barry that goes back to the past. Past Barry learns that there are fixed points in history that cannot be changed. Correct? And we'll talk about how that. So if you watch the movie, you see in the Speed Force, and they keep running back in the past to change what has happened, which is basically the Kryptonians taking over the world and destroying the world. And past Barry, in the process of running and continuously trying to change the past so this doesn't happen, present Barry realizes that in any timeline, in all the timelines, the same outcome occurs, which in the way he explained it is a fixed point in time. This fixed point in time, no matter what world, no matter what universe, no matter what timeline, has to happen this way if you change events the way that they did. And so present Barry decides that he has to let his mother die. In whatever world, whatever timeline, whatever universe, it doesn't matter. He has to let his mother die in order to save the world. Past Barry does not agree with this. And we find out, because they're in the Speed Force at the time, so all of the different alternate versions of timelines of Barry's can meet each other, we find out that a little bit more future than the past, but not the present Barry that we know, has gone back in the past and tried to change the past so often that he kind of mutates into this like weird version of himself, and he kills past Barry. He kills past Barry not intentionally, because he's trying to kill present Barry that wants to allow his mother to die. But past Barry saves present Barry and ends up killing himself. And in the process of killing past Barry, he kills that slightly future version of himself that was trying to save his mother by killing present Barry, who wanted to let the mother die in order to preserve that fixed point in time. Whew. You see why being a Flash fan has been so complicated over the years. Okay. So where are we at? We are at... So the question that this has sparked the question in my brain, why if past Barry gets killed, and by killing past Barry, it kills that slightly future version, that mutated version of herself, but it doesn't kill present Barry? And I don't know if it was the movie or it was like one of the ended explain videos on YouTube that I can't remember where I got this explanation, but it made sense. It's because that Barry doesn't exist in the same timeline as past Barry. Simple as that. And if we go by the theory that Q introduced of alternate universes and alternate timelines coinciding with alternate universes, that makes sense. So past Barry and his slightly future self exist in the same timeline, but also because they're in the Speed Force, they can meet each other. But present Barry does not exist in that timeline, that world, or that universe. Now the question can be raised: why does past Barry and his slightly future self exist in the same timeline when, in theory, anytime you go back in the past, you create a new timeline. So they shouldn't have existed in the same timeline. So even him killing his past self should not have killed him. And that version of Barry still should have been a threat to present Barry. But that's a whole rabbit hole that I'm not going to go into, because why create more rabbit holes? Why do that? Let's just stick with the one rabbit hole that we're trying to tackle right now. Okay, then present Barry travels back to the future, and we see everything back in order except for two things. We see that Barry fixes the alternate timeline in the past where Barry fixes that alternate past timeline event that allows his father to get off on the murder charge of killing his mother, of killing Barry's mother, or killing his wife. Let me start. Barry travels back to the future. He changed events in the past timeline, which created a new timeline where his father actually gets off on the murder charge. But when he goes outside of the courthouse, he meets Batman, and Batman is different. This makes sense when you think about it, because present Barry actually doesn't go back to his current present, which is the future, while he is in the alternate timeline past at all, like we just discussed. So when Barry is in the past and he goes back to his present, which would be the future for that for the past. So he goes back to the future or back to his present. He's actually not going back to his present. He's going back to an alternate timeline present. Okay. So that alternate timeline, his father gets off on a murder charge because of the changes he made in that alternate past, and Bruce Wayne is a different person. So does the original world, so it begs the question, does the original world that Barry came from, where that evidence doesn't exist to exonerate his father, and Ben Affleck is Bruce Wayne, does that world still exist? And in theory, yes, it does. It still exists, but Barry isn't in that world. He isn't on that timeline. He isn't in that universe anymore, because by contrast, he created a different timeline with his decision to change the past. So then the question becomes, can Barry pick and choose which worlds and timeline he visits? So could Barry go back to the original timeline of world where his father is still in jail and Ben Affleck is still Bruce Wayne? The TV show does explore this, and I can't say that I ever really understood it. And it was 9 seasons of convoluted show that I refused to go back and try to understand. But there are certain points and plot points that were very important in the show that I will talk about. Okay, so I said I was not going to get too heavy in the Flash TV show time travel paradoxes, because no one, I mean, it's like I said, 9 seasons of convolution. Is convolution a word? Convoluted time travel paradoxes. But okay, but I will talk about a couple things. So let's do this. Okay, so one of these paradoxes, I guess you can say, on the Flash TV show does kind of explain how all this works. So in season 2, there is a plot point that addresses the idea of alternate timeline and how they exist. So when Thawne, who is the main baddie in the Flash, who actually when we meet Thawne as the Reverse Flash, who has yet to go back in time to kill Barry's mother. So that's the Thawne we're talking about in season 2. He actually has not gone back in time to kill Barry's parents yet. So what he does is he waits in the Speed Force, because he understands time travel and alternate universe and how it creates alternate universes and timelines. So what he does, because he has that understanding, is he waits in the Speed Force, which keeps his timeline intact. So nothing changes, and he doesn't create an alternate timeline or world where his plan might get disrupted due to time travel. So in theory, by staying in the Speed Force, and this is just in the Flash, future Thawne has created a timeline that stays intact, where he can travel back and forth through that one linear timeline. Remember, we talk about linear timelines. One linear timeline without it creating alternate versions of itself. I know. That is where most of the confusion comes from, and is explained in the Flash movie with past alternate versions of Bruce. When Bruce tells Barry that the reason some people are different or just don't exist in that version of the timeline is because he actually isn't traveling parallel in one timeline. He is actually creating alternate timelines. So at that point, the whole movie really should have been null and void, because the question should have been raised at that point. Well, if I'm not in my timeline and things that I do here won't actually affect my timeline, but instead create a new different future timeline, what am I doing? Like, why am I doing it? Can I even get back to that timeline? Or how will I know which timeline I've affected by making these changes in the past if they just branch off and create a new timeline? So anyways, Barry in the different timeline, when he goes back to the past, also going in the past is a different world in a different universe. So whatever changes he makes should in theory create a different outcome in the future, in that timeline, in that universe, not his own original timeline in universe or world, right? Which we already discussed. He can't go back to his, or he doesn't go back to his own timeline. In fact, he goes to a different timeline. So see the problem? Okay, so the problem here is, so when Barry goes back to the future, he isn't going back to his original world timeline. And in theory, that timeline and world still exists where nothing changed, and he is basically doing a 360 for nothing. I think it is very convenient that he manages to go to a world in the future where his past actions does change events in a way that he wants them to, which it exonerates his father. Even though he can't save his mother, it still exonerates his father, because he could have easily traveled to a future world or timeline where, I don't know, his father had already died on death row. That's kind of morbid, but it's true. The best way to describe this in my head is the show Sliders. I think that show did a great job of explaining time travel to different or parallel universes, because the Earth worlds that they traveled to also were similar in some way, but different enough to not be our world. And they spent the entire time trying to get back to our world. And if you think about why all those Earth exist, is because someone in some universe on the Earth like ours experienced life, and in just experiencing life created an alternate universe that the people in Sliders could travel to. So for Barry, he is the catalyst for creating a different world / timeline. And he is trying to travel in a straight line in that universe. But as Bruce explains to him, he can't. Instead, he is like the cast in the Sliders, and the people in the show Sliders, traveling to different timelines and subsequently different worlds. So the whole thing that the TV show is preserving. So the whole thing with the TV show, not the movie, the TV show, from season 2 on up to the end, was preserving the timeline. And in preserving the timeline, you're preserving your world and your universe, and not traveling to different worlds and different universes. And we'll talk about this when I start talking about Loki, because they explain this very well. So that show was obsessed with preserving the timeline, at least in the beginning, and then everything just nosedive into absolute mess of contradiction, because time travel is basically a mess of contradiction. So now let's talk about Loki and their explanations of timelines, which I think Marvel does a far better job of explaining things. So if you remember in Loki, the introduction of time agents and time variants, right? So when we start with the show Loki, he's being arrested by time agents because of his infractions, and his infractions being actions which created different timelines in alternate universes, which explains how Loki isn't dead, because I think he's dead in one of the universes or whatever. But anyways, so time variants were obsessed with, again, just like in the TV show Flash, were obsessed with preserving the timeline. But the way that they explain it is preserving the one original sacred timeline. That's the timeline we exist in. So just assume that us right now, you listening to me, is the world where Loki exists and the Avengers exist. This is the sacred timeline, right? So this is the timeline that the variants want to preserve. So they arrest Loki because of his infractions, right? For creating different timelines in different universes. Now let's get into it a little bit, just a little bit, because I don't want to get into it's complicated. Okay, so that's the gist. So like with most things Marvel does, it's a little bit better than how the DC explains it. But in the MCU timeline, so in the MCU timelines, linear timelines, but like we'll call them linear timelines, right? Because we just talked about how timelines create different universes and parallel worlds and things like this. So this timeline is linear. That's why it's called the sacred timeline. So it's linear and are contained with the Infinity Stones. So one of the big things with Infinity Stones is that they contain the timeline, which means they keep the timeline linear. And whenever one of those Infinity Stones are removed, like Loki did, it creates that parallel alternate world timeline universe, right? So where I talk about Thawne staying in the Speed Force, which I guess we can look at the Speed Force, Infinity Stones, and space-time continuum all as the same thing. They are all the flow of time. And if you remove or change any aspect of these things, they branch off and create different timelines. And with Hugh's theory of alternate universes, different timelines in different universes. So you can see why time variants or time agents are so serious about these crimes. Okay, so in Loki, the time variants have the ability to scrub out timelines in order to preserve the sacred timeline, which is the one linear timeline where our world and universe exists. It would be the same thing that Barry, when he traveled back in the past, thought he was doing before he understood how time travel worked. Okay? So he thought he was traveling. This is just this place for Flash in the MCU. He thought that his timeline was protected by the Infinity Stones and he could travel that one line back and forth, and that didn't happen. So in the Flash, the way the TV show explained that the Speed Force and being right there in Speed Force created, the way Thawne did it, created that linear timeline, which Barry didn't know how to do because it was the first time doing it in the movie, and so it created alternate universes. Anyway, so okay, so I won't get too far into Loki, but one of the reasons that the time agents exist is to secure the original timeline and also prevent another time war, basically where the multiverse descends into civil war, kind of, so to speak. Now, there are alternate worlds that time agents could snuff out. The alternate worlds time agents can snuff out. Time. Oh goodness, I'm talking too long. Time agents can snuff out those alternate universes. If those alternate worlds, universes, timelines don't grow so far advanced that they are so different than the original timeline, which is the one where we live. They can just erase them, and the fear is that this will occur, like alternate timelines will occur so much that it will create a multiverse that will eventually war with each other again, because apparently this has happened in the past. Okay, so that's 33 minutes of trying to explain time travel, alternate universes, the multiverse, and different timelines in comic books, the DCU and MCU. That's really all I have the know-how for or the mental capacity to absorb at the moment. Let me know if that helped. If not, let me know how it confused even more. Don't forget to like, share, positive feedback, and subscribe. And if you have anything to add from the comic books or anything that I got wrong or anything you want to add, just do it respectfully and put it in the comment section, and I will see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification. Bye, guys.